This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury this September in Amsterdam for the second Grand Rounds Europe, an R&D forum focused on translational science at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello, and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I'm Lindsay Martin, Biopharma analyst at BioCentury, and I'm joined today by Matt Gline, CEO of Roivant Sciences. With a Harvard degree in physics and a decade of experience in the finance industry, Matt first joined Roivant as CFO in 2016 before becoming CEO in 2021. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. I want to start by talking about Roivant's strategy. So Roivant has historically been known for its hub and spoke model, building value by spinning out subsidiary companies with in-license programs known as vants that each operate like startups. And a number of these have been successfully acquired by bigger pharmas. But the company is now pivoting to become a more traditional development and commercialization company. And you've got a near-term commercial launch with Brepocitinib for dermatomyositis. And this is a big change. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about why pivot and why now, and walk us through the decision to pivot and what actually changed and how you're thinking about the business model?
Yeah, thanks. And it's funny, you said the word pivot a few times in that call, and it just makes me think. I don't know that we internally conceive of any of this as a pivot. I think our business, like many, has evolved. I'll say, look, you start out, and I've been at Roivant for 10 years. Roivant's 12 years old as a company, so I missed the very beginning. But you start out as a company, and you've kind of got to make it work no matter how you can. And frankly, as a biotech company on day one, the risks to success are so immeasurably large that it's impossible to conceive of the end game. And so you say things like, eventually we'd like to be a commercial company, we'd like to have a drug on the market, but in the meantime, you take what you can get. You take the financings you can do. We had companies that we took public because that was the best way to raise the money. We had companies that we sold because it was the best way to sort of see the assets get commercialized successfully, and we didn't think we could do it ourselves. And so in some ways, where we're at right now just represents the privilege of our past successes, that we finally reached a point where we can do the thing that I think we would have said we wanted to do from the beginning. We just didn't quite have the right combination of capital and assets and opportunity. And so I think that's probably the biggest change is, we had a program that we sold to Roche. We had a program that we sold to Sumitomo. The capital from those sales allowed us to develop our current portfolio. Our current portfolio is, I was going to say once in a lifetime, that's not quite right, but the kind of rare opportunity that I feel like we have the ability to commercialize. The market has shown us how to commercialize. We feel good about where we're at here. So I think it's, the business has evolved to a place where we can do the thing that I think we would have said we wanted to all along. And that feels great.
Right. But the I guess, management of risk and how you assess and mitigate risk is different in the two different kind of approaches, right? So can you talk a little bit about, how do you think about risk and failure now that you are, coming toward a launch versus before when it was more dispersed among the different vants?
And I'll say a few things about that. One is that biotech is inherently a very risky business. Sometimes people ask me about biotech who aren't of biotech, and I describe it as a stupid business, which is at some level true. It is a necessarily dumb endeavor where you have to spend a decade and a ton of money before you know anything about what you've got. And I think we've sort of wandered through that desert and still feel like we're in it at some level, right? We're a $25 billion market cap company, basically without a commercial product right now, which is insane. It's like a wild fact about the world. So I see risk around every corner.
Right.
I think, again, to the point that I was making earlier about privilege, I think, every business, look, at some level, what is business? What is allocation of capital? It's about the taking of risk. And I think the interesting thing is we have reached a stage where we have a significant risk in the commercialization of brepocitinib for syndromic dermatomyositis that we think is worth taking. It's going to matter to patients. We think it's a potentially big opportunity. Our data is good. It's a tractable opportunity. We think we've got the right team in place, and we can afford to take it. We have the capital. We have the sort of setup. We have the sort of situation that allows us to take that risk. And I feel like that is. It's not the first time in our history we've been there. It's not actually the first product in our history that we've launched, but it's definitely the highest conviction opportunity of this kind that we've had. It is a different set of risks. We're very used to taking clinical data risks. We're less used to taking commercial risks. But it's a bet on ourselves, and I think we're ready for it.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. And now I guess that you're, concentrating on these 3 more near-term launches, and you are in this place to take this bet on yourself. Would you say that you are still considering spinning out new vants in the future? Is that, is there less of an appetite for that now that you have the capital and the opportunity to do what you originally wanted to do?
I think the short answer to that question is yes. I think the longer answer to that question is, I think we will continue to, if we are good at what we do, we will continue to create new opportunity. We will continue to find new assets, build new vants, because that's the only way, through a long Darwinian experiment, the only way that we've ever been able to successfully do anything is via this sort of vant model where we put a lot of faith and accountability on a nimble team to run a sort of independent endeavor. And I think we're going to continue to use that model. And I think we are sort of just by nature value oriented. And so I think like where we have the opportunity to consider divestitures, sales, et cetera, I'm sure we will keep considering those things. First of all, I don't know if you've ever been called, offered $1 billion for something and turned it down, but I'll say like that's hard to do every time. Even as you become successful, turning down $1 billion is difficult. And so I think we'll continue to have to face that decision if we're good at what we do. And I'm sure, we'll make a value-oriented decision in each case. I think that doesn't need to be our default plan anymore. And I think it won't be our default plan, certainly for the programs that you've alluded to here. So, we'll take those calls seriously when we get them, but I think we have a portfolio that we are pretty excited to launch ourselves.
Right. Okay. And then I guess I'm thinking, okay, so, if the right opportunity or the right program comes along that you are interested in creating a vant from, what does that look like? And how do you now kind of strategize as to where that fits into the broader portfolio for Roivant?
So we have these 3 great late-stage assets that you've alluded to. We have other things going on as well. Some earlier stage things, some residuals from past activity that we think are potentially interesting, et cetera. And I think we're always sort of thinking about portfolio construction. I think, look, the cold hard truth of capital allocation is when we were a $5 or $6 or $7 billion company, turning $200 or $300 or $400 million of investment into $2 or $3 or $4 billion of value, which is objectively an amazing outcome, right? You take $200 million, you sort of multiply it by 10. It's a great outcome. That would have been a 30-40% increase in the value of our business. At $25 billion, it's a less than 10% increase in the value of our business. And it is no easier to do that at our current size than it was before. And so I think just like necessarily, we feel like we need to take bigger swings for it to be worth the management attention, the focus, et cetera. So I think that is like a change for us. But the one thing about biotech that isn't stupid is that there are big swings to take, right? When you're trying to improve human health, cure disease, these are really hard things to do. We are developing software for alien supercomputers that we don't fully understand. Like, it's hard. But there are big swings to take. So I think we will find opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and then I know you've invested heavily in AI-driven discovery too. I'm thinking about Cythera, Proxima, some of these other vants and Silicon Therapeutics. So where does AI investment and that kind of strategy fit into your broader portfolio, and then also in how you're kind of thinking about moving forward in terms of investment as well and growing the portfolio.
Yeah. As an investment strategy for Roivant, we made a concerted effort 5 or 6 years ago at this point to invest in sort of tech-enabled and AI-enabled drug discovery as a way of building our pipeline. And I would say we succeeded at that in the sense that, like you mentioned, Proxima and Cythera, like I think there are like some interesting businesses and interesting programs that came out of it. But I'd say like as an investment strategy for Roivant, it was not particularly successful. That is like, it has not been a major driver of our value. And, you know, while I think those businesses are interesting, frankly, in my view, no single specific AI or tech-enabled, well, very few specific AI or tech-enabled discovery efforts have at this point sort of affirmed their value. It's just been a tough journey. And I think that's about drug discovery being hard and about the tools being early in their lives. I think eventually this stuff will matter. I think eventually these tools are going to matter. And I hope that Cythera and Proxima and some of the businesses that have come out of Roivant are long-term successful. My current view is AI for drug discovery, which is the subject of a lot of ink and a lot of dollars of investment and many people's time, is an idea whose time is coming but isn't quite here yet. That is, like, those businesses are still all about promise and less about delivery. And I'm excited that people are working on them, but I think it's very hard. And in particular, I think a lot of that stuff, it's just the fruit at the very top of the tree. It is the hardest of the hard of problems to solve with AI. And what I think is interesting is, like, we have deployed all of the enterprise grade AI tools to Roivant at this point. And what I think is interesting is, like, would I call Roivant an AI enabled drug development company? Absolutely. But in some ways, that's like a little bit of a silly moniker, because what it really means is we've given our employees Claude and they have embraced it fully. They're using it all over the place. And it turns out the fruit at the bottom of the tree is like boring. Its clinical development is a human coordination problem involving lots of emails and management of giant piles of similar documents and site agreements and patient enrollment and reading charts. And these tools are so good at that stuff that it is like daily transforming how we develop drugs. And I hope and believe that we are at the forefront of that. But it's this very organic process at this point. It's not like stamping AI on our foreheads and claiming to be an AI company. It's just, it turns out we're at a moment where if you give the right smart people the tools and the ability to use them aggressively, they will do it and it will matter.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue every biotech company is now an AI company. So, okay. Yeah, that's, I mean, also an interesting take too.
But all of them are, maybe none of them are. I don't know.
What do you think is, what would be needed to really get that top of the tree?
You know, look, by the way, I think the field is going to get there. I think the problem for drug discovery, which again, this is not the heart of our business right now, is it's related to the problem of drug development. Drug discovery involves, like, discovering a new drug that is going from a blank sheet of paper to, forget like an approved medicine, but to like a drug that can be dosed in humans, is a composite of 150 different difficult problems. And what I think is each of those problems at present requires bespoke AI solutions, right? In the sense that, like, the data to train a model is, even if you're training like similar models, the data to train a model is different. Answering the question, will this molecule be permeable and get into a cell, requires data about permeability. Answering a question, will this molecule bind to this target, requires data about binding and affinity. Answering a question, will it have off-target toxicity, requires a different kind of binding and affinity data. Will attacking this specific biological target, modulating this protein, create a biological effect, requires yet a different data set. And what I think we have is hundreds and hundreds of companies, each trying to solve one or two or three of those 150 problems. And I think the problem is those companies may, in fact, and this is like a wild truth, be the best people in the world at cell permeability modeling, or the best people in the world at affinity modeling, or the best people in the world at modeling the cytokine inflammatory pathway in biological models. The problem is we're basically just going to be average at best at the other 147 problems. And if you're the
Right, you have
best in the
to
world at 3
put
out
it
of
together.
150 problems and average at the other 147, and you only have the capital and time and energy to run 2 experiments, it turns out you're just like never going to have the alpha to succeed unless you get really lucky. And so what I think is probably going to happen is like hundreds of companies are going to solve 2 problems here and 3 problems here and 2 problems here, and some
Yeah,
of them will succeed and most of them will not, just by luck. And then at the
right.
end, there's going to be tools to solve 80 or 90 or 100 of the 150 problems. And when you composite those tools together, you will wind up with a radically transformed field of drug development. It's not obvious to me that any individual AI company is going to make it through that. But at the end, Merck is going to be a lot better at developing drugs because they're going to survive on the whatever, the trash
Right.
heap or the pile of carcasses of failed AI companies that will like build this new exoskeleton for Merck on which to develop drugs. And many of those
Yeah.
companies will be successful. It's just going to be hard.
No, I'm with you on that. I think, and we're definitely seeing, yeah, data is a limiting factor, and then integrating that across scales and contexts.
And some of this, by the way, like whatever, foundation models, LLMs, ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, they are at some level mirrors, right? They are just reflections back
Right.
of human knowledge. And it just turns out human knowledge is vast. And so they can do incredibly impressive things by sort of processing the knowledge we have. One of the reasons that biotech is a dumb business, back to my earlier comment, is there are just limitations on human knowledge in biotech. We don't actually know what happens if you modulate most protein targets in people.
Right.
The data doesn't exist. No matter how much data you throw into a model, that may never be able to answer that question unless we run certain science experiments. There are some questions that we probably can answer better by taking a composite of all of the data we already have. And my guess is these models will be good at answering those questions, but there are many questions we can't. I'm talking a lot about AI here, which is, by the way, a topic I'm like entirely unqualified to talk about. We are not.
Well,
There are other much smarter people than me working on these problems.
well, let's pivot then. Let's talk about the first program that you're aiming to launch right now is Brepocitinib, a dual JAK1 TYK2 inhibitor. And you're pursuing that first for dermatomyositis, which is a more rare disease with no approved therapies. And then you've got trials following in non-infectious uveitis and cutaneous sarcoidosis. You've got a PDUFA date in September, and you're hoping to launch this year. So what are you doing right now to prepare for this more orphan disease launch? And, when we've spoken before, you've talked about companies that are in like biotech's graduating class, like Argenx and Alnylam. Are there
Yeah.
any lessons that you're taking from those companies to help prepare for your launch?
Yeah. First of all, just clarify, we've said our PDUFA date is in the third quarter. We haven't said what month. Yeah, look, it's a great question. Obviously, at this stage in the game, as you're approaching a PDUFA date, as you're approaching sort of whatever, it's the day where you finally get to give your product to real patients in the wild and hopefully help them. There's a lot to do, and there's a whole team of people, not me specifically, working on everything from hiring field medical professionals to building a patient support organization to figuring out how the pills are going to get from the manufacturer to the warehouse to the pharmacy to the patient. And all of that work is ongoing. And it's all consuming. It's an incredible effort that takes a village. And I believe in the team that we have doing it, but it's a lot of work. I think one of the great things about this moment in time for us is we do get to stand, like 8 years ago, if we were about to launch a product, even in a market like dermatomyositis, I think the world would be skeptical of our ability to do so because the world was littered with carcasses of biotech companies that had tried unsuccessfully to do things like this. That's not true anymore. Horizon with Tepezza and Insmed and Alnylam and Argenx and Madrigal and Verona and BridgeBio have all launched, and many others have all launched drugs successfully in a way that I think has changed the game in terms of what biotech companies are now believed to be able to do. In fact, my opinion is many of those companies have launched drugs better than big pharma companies might have launched those same drugs. And some of that has to do with the markets. It has to do with the fact that a lot of those drugs have been launched into sort of orphan or semi-orphan indications. where the number of prescribers is smaller and those prescribers are sophisticated and in many cases academic, and biotech companies have been able to cover them and have been able to do creative things from a commercial model perspective, and rebating in those markets is less of a driver. So the sort of muscle of big pharma matters less. And I think we're trying to learn all of those lessons. We're trying to watch every one of those companies and stand on their shoulders. And I hope we're able to succeed. There's a ton to learn from those exercises.
Right. Yeah, I think when we spoke before, you also mentioned there's really no way to know until you're doing it. So, in other
Right.
words, but with that, we're going to take a brief break now, and when we come back, we'll chat a bit more about the market dynamic of your upcoming launch, and then we'll dive deeper into the biology as well.
Great. Sounds good.
The second edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe convenes the leaders shaping the future of biopharma. This time we meet in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th, gathering academic innovators, biotech CEOs, pharma R&D leaders and investors to debate the translational science that will define the next decade. Grand Rounds Europe focuses on what matters most: breakthrough biology, transformative technologies, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Grand Rounds is where rigorous science meets real-world execution. Join BioCentury and regional host chairs Forbion and BGV and take a deep dive on translational opportunities in the Benelux region. BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, where discovery moves toward impact. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
You're listening to the BioCentury Show, and I'm Lindsay Martin, and I'm joined by Matt Gline today from Roivant Sciences. So Matt, we previously talked a bit about your upcoming launch of Brepocitinib, and I want to know a bit more about how you're thinking globally. So I know that Roivant has commercial rights in both the US and Japan. So how are you thinking about Japan as a market?
It's interesting. Japan is a major pharmaceutical market, has been for a long time. It's a complicated place, different population dynamics, different drug pricing dynamics. We have rights there and in the US, as you mentioned. So I think we're excited about the Japan commercial opportunity, and dermatomyositis is prevalent. It's a severe disease in Japan. So I think there is absolutely a commercial opportunity there. We have not fully decided exactly how we're going to commercialize in Japan, whether we'll do it ourselves, whether we'll, plausibly, potentially even likely eventually do it via a partner there just for commercial reasons. There's certainly lots of highly qualified partners in Japan. It's interesting in that even in my sort of 10 years in the business, I think Japan has evolved pretty significantly, both in terms of the kind of work happening there versus in China and other places, and then in terms of its like primacy as a market. But it's a huge opportunity, and there's a lot of patient need there. So I'm excited to see our drug through.
Yeah, it sounds like definitely a good opportunity, a good patient population there as well. In terms of the biology of Brepocitinib, it's really a unique molecule in that it's a dual inhibitor and it's selective for JAK1, right? So most of the JAK inhibitors target different combinations of JAKs, like JAK1, JAK2, JAK1, JAK3, and getting that selective JAK1 is more difficult. Can you talk a bit about why that dual inhibition and selectivity really matters for this disease?
Yeah.
And then how are you differentiating to show that the outcome matters in your phase 3 data versus, what a pure JAK1 or pure TYK2 inhibitor could do?
Yeah, perfect. So look, first of all, I'll say, and you sort of called this out, I think we would think of Brepocitinib as sort of a third generation of a JAK inhibitor, where the first generation were these kind of dirtier pan-JAK inhibitors that were just not built for selectivity. They hit lots of different JAK isoforms, and that was what they were. Then there was this sort of second generation of drugs like Rinvoq that were pretty highly selective, let's say JAK1 inhibitors, for example, in the case of Rinvoq, or like TYK2 deucravacitinib, a selective TYK2 inhibitor that was allosteric. And now we have drugs like Brepocitinib, they're sort of third generation inhibitors where they're not only selective, but they're multi-selective. And so you can sort of pick and choose multiple different JAK isoforms and target them. And that gives you access to, multiple pathways of inflammation. And I think that's a part of the reason Brepo is such a good drug is it turns out that JAK1 and TYK2 are separately, JAK isoforms pairwise signal various cytokines. And so by having both JAK1 and TYK2, we hit the JAK1 cytokines, the TYK2 cytokines, we especially hit the ones that are sort of at the intersection of JAK1 and TYK2. That turns out to be particularly good for interferon-driven disease, of which dermatomyositis is one. And so I think that, the fact that we have dual inhibition against JAK1 and TYK2 made dermatomyositis a good choice of indication for us. And many of the indications we're studying are sort of either Th1 cytokine driven or interferon driven diseases where we think the combination of JAK1 and TYK2 are going to matter. The other thing I'll say more generally, though, is we made that decision back in 2021 at a time where it wasn't totally clear where the field of JAK inhibitors were going. In that, there are, as with any immune suppressive category, some safety liabilities associated with JAK inhibitors.
Right.
And at the time in 2021, there was a question about whether they were going to fall in favor of other different anti-inflammatory mechanisms that had different safety profiles. What has happened since then is JAK inhibitors have been enormously successful in prevalent disease, right? Rinvoq is an $8 or $9 billion drug in inflammatory bowel disease and skin disease and rheumatoid arthritis. And so I think in addition to the sort of special profile of Brepocitinib as a dual inhibitor of JAK1 and TYK2, we also get to occupy this privileged position of the sort of leading JAK inhibitor franchise for orphan disease, which I think is a huge opportunity. There are many, many orphan inflammatory diseases that are way underserved, and the setup of Brepocitinib allows us to study many of those diseases.
Right. Okay. I guess I could also see a world in which you pursue a bigger indication outside of the orphan space, right? Like TYK2 and psoriasis is huge right now. Can you talk a little bit about your indication selection strategy, pursuing those more orphan diseases? And do you ever see a world in which you would go to compete with the bigger indications?
Yeah, I think for Brepocitinib, from a commercial perspective, from a development perspective, we are really focused on these like orphan and orphan-like indications. And I don't think it's going to make a ton of sense to add more prevalent disease into the Brepocitinib specifically development path. We do think JAK inhibitors generally are exciting drugs for big indications. We could certainly build on that idea or other mechanisms. We at one point developed an anti-TL1A antibody for a while for inflammatory bowel disease. Like there are big indication opportunities. We commercialized the drug in psoriasis at one point. So I think we are excited about markets big and small, but I think for Brepocitinib, we're really focused on orphan disease. And I think, I think for us, it's about finding the right orphan diseases, obviously, where clinical development is possible in the way that we like to do it and where the unmet need is high. I think we're very privileged in that Brepocitinib specifically and drugs of these mechanisms generally tend to be highly efficacious in inflammatory disease. And so we're sort of spoiled for choice in terms of places to go. And I expect we will continue to add more orphan indications for Brepo in the coming months and years.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. And let's pivot a little bit to talk about the next program that's up for launch through Immunovant, the FcRN antibody. Like Brepocitinib, you have multiple indications. You've got Graves' disease, thyroid eye disease, difficult to treat rheumatoid arthritis. And really the thesis here, at least from what I've read, is that deeper IgG suppression translates to better outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about how you're weighing depth of suppression versus the duration of suppression, and how that really matters for these different indications that you've or that you're pursuing the drug in, and then how the, I guess, mechanistic complexity of the indication also matters. So like for Graves' disease versus thyroid eye disease, which is kind of more downstream effects.
Yeah. Yes. So anti-FcRn antibodies, as you sort of alluded to, they work by regulating this neonatal Fc receptor that is involved in the recycling of IgG. And so the biology is elegant It is a little bit complicated in its nature, but actually, like, its effect is simple and easy to understand. You
Right.
have these circulating antibodies, and some diseases are caused by pathogenic circulating antibodies, right? Antibodies to your thyroid or your neuromuscular junction or something. And if you lower the level of those antibodies, you improve those diseases. And I think one surprising fact that, I think we had some guess that would be true before, but I think has just been borne out now clinically with the class, is you can safely lower circulating IgG levels by 80+% without major effects. And so you can
Right.
treat these diseases safely. And so these FcRn antibodies have been, fairly safe and well tolerated and highly efficacious at treating diseases that are caused by circulating IgG autoantibodies. We believe that, and we think we've shown across indications, and we think the field has shown across indications with a lot of clinical data at this point, that unsurprisingly, the more you lower the level of these autoantibodies, the better you treat disease. And we believe that we suppress IgG autoantibodies or IgG antibody levels generally sort of the most of any FcRn in late stage development, practically. Just like the way these drugs are being developed now. And we think that gives us a shot in any indication of best-in-class efficacy. Obviously, that's a piece of the picture, and that has informed how we're developing the drug. In terms of indication selection, I'll say, like, one of the things that's been sort of cool to see for the FcRn class is you have indications like Graves' disease, which I would call our lead indication, or like myasthenia
Right.
gravis, that are very much straightforwardly driven by autoantibodies. If you kind of
Yes.
like we sort of understand the autoantibody to be the main driver of disease, then you have indications like rheumatoid arthritis, which are very multifactorial. They are inflammatory, they are autoantibody driven. There's like a bunch of different sort of immune complex stuff happening,
Right.
of which autoantibody is only one. You mentioned TED. That's another disease where it starts out as an autoantibody driven disease. It starts out as Graves' disease, in fact, but like eventually as it matures, you get other things that are driving disease activity.
Right.
And, I think unsurprisingly, it is more straightforward to treat diseases that are more clearly autoantibody driven than diseases that are more complex in their nature. But like we showed recently with our rheumatoid arthritis data, for example, that it may be possible to select A, for patients who are more autoantibody driven, and B, to generate data. And it's been shown in Sjogren's, it's been shown in RA, it's shown in a couple of places that for these immune complex diseases, you can actually generate benefit for these patients through this one specific axis of modulation.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I think also the step down dosing versus continuous dosing is a strategy where, instead of reducing a dose, you're getting sustained suppression. And so I think that's also one way that your program differentiates in terms of suppression of the IgG levels.
We certainly hope that the level of depth of IgG suppression that we can deliver durably over time will be a differentiator for us.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing more on that. I want to have us zoom out a little bit. China seems to be on everyone's mind among Western biotechs, and I'd like to know a bit more about how competition with China has shaped Roivant's strategy. And, are you thinking about this? What's on your mind?
Yeah. I dislike the framing competition with China because, first of all, in the end, and this is probably true in every industry, but it's definitely true in biotech, when the world gets better, everyone's better off, right? If we have more drugs to treat more diseases, everyone wins. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, at present, and this is in part a complicated political point because it relates to US drug pricing and the healthcare system, even if you are a developer of a drug in China, the thing you ultimately care most about is how do you get your drug developed in the US for the US market? And so all of those drugs ultimately are looking to come here. And what we do, what Roivant does, is clinical development, especially clinical development focused on US approval of drugs. So I think like more available drugs in the world to develop here is actually good for us. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, in particular, one of the things that has been exciting in China lately has been that, as Chinese FDA has evolved and as the sort of clinical development landscape in China has shifted, it's clear that you can develop early proof of concept data for a drug in China very quickly and inexpensively. And that's not a privilege restricted to Chinese drugs. Anybody can generate that data in China quickly and inexpensively. And that is, again, a huge benefit to the world. It reduces the cycle times and cost of drug development. Chinese firms and experts in Chinese clinical development will be the early beneficiaries, but we will all win in the end from that time improvement. The last thing I'll say is I think like a lot of ink is spilled and conversations are had about like drug discovery in China. And it is undeniably true that China has built an incredible biotech industry in terms of antibody discovery, in terms of small molecule drug discovery. I think part of this, calling it a China phenomenon, is a little bit of a missing the point, in that really what's happened is, thanks in part to the efforts of Chinese firms, but in a way that is not specific to China, antibody discovery in particular has become a commodity good. And whereas like
Right.
15 or 20 years ago, only a small number of people could develop antibodies well, now many people can develop antibodies well, especially against certain targets. And so it is just faster and cheaper to go from zero to a functional, efficacious antibody against many targets. And right now, a lot of those antibodies happen to be discovered in China, but if we completely close off the US's barrier walls to like Chinese drugs, it would happen in India, it would happen in Southeast Asia, it would happen in the
Yeah.
US at AI-driven companies, it would happen all over the place.
Right. I would, yeah,
Part of
argue
the
that that's happening
Yeah.
here.
And I think part of the adjustment that we all need to make is an antibody against a target is less scarce than it used to be. Having the first may matter less because there's 50 CD19 by CD3 bispecifics now,
Right.
and smart clinical development and different commercial strategies are going to be necessary to account for that. And I think if we start thinking of this as like a geopolitical China issue, we're just going to realize a couple of years from now that we've missed the forest for the trees.
Yeah, yeah, and that's definitely a perspective BioCentury has taken as well, and that innovation everywhere is good for everyone, right? I guess
Yeah,
the to give an analogy, right? If you want to run faster, you have to run with people who are faster than you. So
that's right.
gotta have competition amongst everyone to push everyone to do better. So
Yeah.
okay. Um, so I guess to follow up on that though, like have you or has Roivant used investigator-initiated trials in China to generate that early data, or is this more something that's on the horizon?
I'm trying to remember if any of the specific IITs that we've run have been like China specific, and I can't think of any, but it's certainly possible that we have. We have
Right.
looked at many programs to in-license from China, and we've certainly looked at a lot of clinical data generated in China in informing development decisions and informing acquisition decisions. So I think we have been a
Right.
huge beneficiary of the generation of this data, and we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out how to run faster generally. And by the way,
Yeah.
like, that is like specific, like again, we've run phase 1 studies in Australia and New Zealand many times because it turns
Right.
out to be an efficient place to run those studies, potentially more efficient than China.
Yeah.
And so I think like there's a lot of components to this, but absolutely we are thinking aggressively around how to use Chinese sites, Chinese trials as a part of an overall global strategy to generate the data that matters as quickly as you can.
Right. Okay. Okay. Um, and then we'll pivot a little bit here for our last question today. But BioCentury has counted Roivant among biotech's tier jumpers, and your market cap has nearly doubled to 25 billion since January. So, what's next on the horizon? Like 5 years from now, what do you think a successful company is in terms for Roivant?
Yeah. Man, being a public CEO of a biotech company is a humbling experience, in that it's very much a "what have you done for me lately" vibe out there. And I can think of other successful biotech companies that you would also probably call tier jumpers, that because they've had more volatile stock price performance in the last 6 or 12 months, their CEOs have gone from being genius investor darlings to idiots overnight. And I'm like, whatever. I'm just like, I see that coming for me at some point, and I'm like, well, it's not going to.
That's not you, don't worry.
Oh, no, it will be eventually, though, right? It's the nature of the business. If we're successful, eventually, we'll stumble on something. Some trial will fail. It'll take us a little while. Whatever. I have no doubt that we, like every other company, will not be successful at everything we do forever. Even if the long arc of success comes for us, it will be volatile along the way. Um, Look, I think the path from here is relatively clear. In the near term, I think there's a lot available to us just from executing. If we can get good data on the trials we're running, if the Brepocitinib launch can go well, if we can choose good indications for the existing drugs, I think like a lot more value creation is available
Right.
from here, potentially a doubling or more of our value from here just from the bird in hand.
Right.
And I'd like to see that through. I'd like to make that happen. And then I think to build something even bigger and more lasting beyond that, we'll have to grow, we'll have to scale, we'll have to add more programs, we'll have to keep doing this thing. I am very proud of what we've built, and that I think creative, aggressive clinical development has always been at some level, if not the single most important pillar of pharma, by far one of the most important pillars of pharma. And I think if we remain good at that, the world's our oyster. If we can keep doing that and add commercializing drugs successfully to it, there is no limit to how large the limits to how large an enterprise you can build on those things alone are many times our current value. And so I think like that's a good feeling. But it's also very clear that even big pharma companies live in a "what have you done for me lately" world. And when we go from here to a $50 billion market cap, we'll be getting a lot of questions about how that becomes 75 or 100 or 150, and we're going to have to figure it out.
Right. Yeah, I guess like what you said earlier, doing it now is no different or no easier than it was, before. So, okay. But I'm excited to see where this launch may take you.
Me too.
And with that, do you want to give a quick plug for your personal podcast before we wrap?
Oh, I'm happy to. I as a side job to my day job as a CEO, also do an occasional show called Off Target Effects, where I interview people who I think are fun and interesting about the ways in which our industry is weird. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to plug it. We did a couple episodes recently with some investors and other CEOs that I thought were fun. So give a listen if you think to.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us today, Matt. It was great to chat with you. But that's all we have time for today. Thanks for tuning into the BioCentury Show.
Thank you very much.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury this September in Amsterdam for the second Grand Rounds Europe, an R&D forum focused on translational science at the interface of industry and academia.